All right, so first I want to say I pray to God I never have to go after Josh again. Speaking of panic, definitely feeling that right now. I want to talk to you guys about filmmaking and how we can look at the processes, the techniques that filmmakers use in creating their products in what we do as interaction designers. So, let's see. So a little bit about myself. My name's Adam Connor. I work for Mad Pow. I've been a designer for about 10 years now. And prior to becoming a designer, I studied film and animation for a few years. And what's always drawn me to film is a great filmmaker's ability to really kind of take an audience by the hand and lead them through emotions and make them feel things and think about things in ways that they otherwise wouldn't. And this idea of emotion keeps coming up in the conference, and it keeps coming up in projects that I'm involved in. So it seems like a great opportunity for me to kind of go back to my studies and look for ways to kind of use some of that material. And just in general, I think one of the greatest things we can do as designers is to constantly keep an eye on other practices and look for ways that they're solving problems, because it might lead us to new discoveries on how we can solve the problems that we face. So I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the challenges that filmmakers face and the tools that they've used to deal with them. And my hope is that this will inspire some of you to look at filmmaking, look at the mechanics of filmmaking a little bit closer next time you're watching a movie. Look for ideas that maybe you can use in the products you're designing. The first challenge I want to talk to you about is orchestration. So a film is really big. There's a lot of things to deal with. And how does a filmmaker make sure that they're coordinating all these things to achieve this series of desired effects, to kind of take their audience by the hand and lead them through these emotions? Filmmakers have to deal with the actors, the things the actors are saying, the stuff that's happening on screen, the dialogue, the sounds that everybody's hearing as they're watching the film. And they do this, they have to manage all this over this course of a development process that, in a very simplified form here, goes from a script to initial designs and storyboards, to the raw footage that gets shot, to a final film that hopefully makes it into a theater. One of the tools that filmmakers use to kind of manage that process and make sure that all the people that are involved in making the creative decisions that are inevitably going to affect how the film reads to an audience is beat sheets. Beat sheets are really nothing more than an outline. It's a scene-by-scene outline focusing on the main plot point for a scene, the key actions that support that plot point, and the best beat sheets that I've come across, either explicitly or implicitly, include some material about what the effect is for the audience. Is it a comedic scene? Is it a dramatic scene? Is it supposed to be overly frightening? These kinds of things help filmmakers kind of keep on track with what should be happening. Now, beat sheets, I started to look at other filmmaking curriculums while I was working on this presentation, and I've noticed that they tend to come up most frequently as a screenwriting tool. But when I was in school, our instructors kind of emphasized the value of this to an entire film crew. And the value is in that this outlines the most important elements of what should be happening at any given point in a film. Anything else that's being worked on in the film at that point in time should be in support of what's here in the beat sheet. So how can we use this in interaction design? If we think about the filmmaking process that I showed a little bit ago, it's very similar to the basic software design process we have. We go from our script, basically our task flows, to the initial concepts, the sketches, the wireframes, to our prototypes and visual designs, to a final product that gets developed and shipped. Again, lots of people involved, lots of opportunities for things to kind of fall off to the side, not really meet the desired goals. So as emotion keeps coming up, I've been looking for ways to keep the emotion in the forefront of the minds of everybody that's involved in a project. And I've tried different things. I've tried kind of beefing up my scenario descriptions, making sure that I'm pumping those full of as much of the emotional pieces that we've come across in research. Those scenario descriptions, they do pretty well, but they're good at describing the start state of something and usually the desired end state. But they, by circumstance of when they're created in a project, they tend to miss all the stuff in the middle because you haven't really gotten there yet, you haven't designed it yet. I've also used comics to try to get these points across. And comics have done very well in communicating emotion, but what I found in projects is that they suffer from a lack of longevity. They aren't really used to go back and reference. Developers aren't looking at your comics. Your visual designers are probably not looking at your comics. Content writers aren't looking at your comics. They tend to do really great for presentations, They get everybody on board initially, but then they just kind of fall by the wayside. So I've been thinking about, what can I do what's going to be an artifact that's going to be in front of people all the time as we create this product and really kind of keep everybody on track of what's the emotion, what's the effect on the user. And so I've been thinking about task flows. Task flows are an outline. Task flows talk about the inputs and the outputs that the system has. So they're halfway there. All I needed to do was to start to annotate them with how does the user feel at this point? How do we want the user to feel at this point? How do we respond to the emotional state? What's the emotional state we want to put people in? So this is very simple. I've just started exploring this. The example here is from a project I worked on for hardship withdrawals out of one's retirement account, which is an extremely emotionally charged experience. You go through a hardship withdrawal when you really don't have anything else and you need the money desperately. So we wanted to make sure that as we designed this, everybody was aware of what the user was feeling. And so we just annotated, how are they feeling? What do we want to make them feel? And we just did that throughout the process. And the feedback I got from the project team after doing this was fairly positive. Like I said, it's very rough. I think there's a lot of places for this to go. But I had visual designers tell me that very early on they were able to make certain design decisions about how they wanted to treat elements and how they wanted things to feel. I had content writers and content strategists tell me that they were able to kind of use this to center how they wanted to frame things, the tone of voice they wanted to use. And the best feedback I got was I had a developer, as he was building out one of the interactions, come and ask me, he challenged me basically, on whether or not the interaction he was building that we had designed actually met one of these goals. And so right there I knew that he was thinking about the emotion. So I think there's something to be had here. And I'd be curious to get your feedback and if any of you have tried something like this and where else can we take this? The next challenge I want to talk to you guys about is communication. So in film, there's this term, the mise-en-scène. And it's a very broadly defined term. A lot of disagreement on what exactly it means. I know we're all very unfamiliar with that. In general, mise-en-scène refers to all of the aspects that a filmmaker has at their disposal to tell a story that aren't dialogue. It's basically the filmmaker's style. It's how they set the stage. It's how they light things. It's the directions that they give actors for them to follow. These kinds of things really make up how a filmmaker is going to communicate. And one of the components of this is motion. So I want to talk about motion. Before I go into motion in film, I want to make it clear that I'm not talking about gratuitous motion in UIs here. Motion tends to get a bad rap in some people's brains about, it's all gratuitous, it's this wow factor, it's not really adding value. There are ways to include motion in a UI that make it very valuable. Motion has an ability to reduce latency in a system. Really great examples of this are Netflix. If you go online and manage your queue, and you click the Move to Top button on any item in your queue, you will actually see it slide out from the list and then slide up to the top, rather than just refresh the screen with your list reordered. All Recipes, I believe, has something similar, where if you're looking at a recipe, you can have a recipe box, and you can add it. And when you click the Add button, you'll actually see that recipe kind of move out from the screen, go into that recipe box. It's reducing latency. It's allowing the user to really kind of create mental models in a much easier fashion than it would if we were just refreshing screens. So how are filmmakers using motion to communicate? Early filmmakers didn't have a lot of the things that we take for granted today in film. There wasn't color, there wasn't sound. The earliest filmmakers, basically at theaters, there would be a band or someone playing the piano, and a lot of that was actually improvised very early on. They didn't have dialogue. They did have speech cards. A lot of people ask about speech cards, but that was primarily seen as a crutch by filmmakers. That's not what they were there for. They were there to tell their stories visually, not by holding up a card with words on it. So they needed to look at the tools they did have and figure out how to communicate through them. So thinking back to the mise-en-scène, all of those elements, they're additive. They all can add little bits of information and together kind of pull together this story for a viewer. So motion being one of the components of mise-en-scène, I want to talk about some of the patterns that filmmakers early on kind of created and how they use them. And the most fun is the bad guy enters on the right. And this is a bit of an extreme statement, but you will hear filmmakers use it. But what this really plays upon is our idea that things flow naturally from left to right. And this is primarily out of Western culture, the fact that we read left to right. But we have this kind of instinctual expectation of flow in a left to right manner. And so filmmakers conscious of this will introduce things that are outside of that flow by moving them in from the right side of the screen. So they immediately kind of contrast this natural expectation. And I have a couple examples here. Hopefully you guys... So the first scene there is from Road to Perdition, which is a great film. And in it, you're introduced to the son of the main character, played by Tom Hanks, who's basically a mob enforcer, and spends... The whole plot of the movie is basically how he and his son are seeking revenge on the mob family that he used to work for, whose the mob boss's son actually killed his wife and other son. And so by introducing the son in that fashion, you get the idea that he's out of sync with that town that he's entering. He just doesn't quite fit. And then the second scene is from Strangers on a Train, a great Alfred Hitchcock film. And you get this idea from the left to right motion of the one pair of shoes juxtaposed to the right to left of the other pair, that this collision is imminent, and an idea of who the protagonist is going to be and who the antagonist is going to be. And then very quickly after that scene, they finally meet on a train. Things kind of go to hell from there. So some other patterns that come up, motion in diagonal directions is a lot of fun. We kind of expect gravity to work by pulling things down, and filmmakers understand that, and filmmakers use that. And direction, moving from top to bottom, gives this sense of inevitability. It's just going to move that way. It's going to take something pretty powerful to stop it. So there's this idea of anticipation. Bottom to top, however, has this sense of struggle. You're working against the odds. So filmmakers will play on this and create scenes where they might actually tilt things to give this idea of direction on a diagonal. But what I think is fun about these patterns in motion and what we do in interfaces is these things are additive. They give subtle little hints, subtle little gut reactions to the people viewing them. And we can play on this when we're trying to figure out how an element should feel to a user. Should it feel like it's somewhat antagonistic? And then we can add little bits by moving it in certain ways to just kind of build up that kind of character for a UI element. The next thing I want to talk about is the camera. So having control of a film camera gives a filmmaker incredible control over the focus of the viewer. There are pans and tilts, zooms and cranes and dollies, all sorts of things that a filmmaker can use to really direct focus. And the most fun example that I have is the rack focus. So rack focus is little to no camera movement, very subtle if any, no complex actions on screen. The things that are on screen are pretty much staying in place, not a lot of changes here. And what happens is the camera will shift the depth of field to bring one thing that was in focus out of focus and bring something else in. And the best examples, best uses of this, use this to kind of reveal new information to a viewing audience, or sometimes to just kind of clarify information or mimic the reveal of information to characters on the screen. So a couple examples of this.
A married woman? That wasn't just some woman.
What are you telling me? Benjamin, will you just tell me what this is all about? Oh, no.
15 genetically designed super spiders.
There's 14.
I beg your pardon?
One's missing.
Yeah.
Huh.
So the first scene's from The Graduate, and in it, the filmmaker used the rack focus to kind of emulate Laurie's realization that her boyfriend had been sleeping with her mother. And I really love the way they bring her back into focus so slowly as she's kind of putting everything together in her brain. And then the second, of course, is from Spider-Man. And they used it there to kind of reveal to the audience, you know, don't forget about this missing spider. It's kind of important. So it's a really fun tool in filmmaking. And you know, I'm really interested in how we might be able to use it. I think the idea, you know, we change the contents of a screen based on interaction to communicate different points. But in this, the contents of the screen really aren't changing. It's just changing how it's presented very subtly. And are there things we can do with that? I think about, you know, the amount of time a user spends on screen, and can we key off of what types of actions might be of a priority based on that? And can we pull up maybe the contrast of certain things and dilute the contrast of other components to kind of play with that? I don't think we need to be blurring things on the screen, actually, although, you know, maybe there's some use for that. But I think there's some things we can do to just kind of shift subtly the communication that an interface has with the user. So where else can this go? One of the great things that I find about this topic, I mean, I've only touched on a few things here. There's other elements. There's editing and sound and lighting and stuff like that. But there's lots of other ways to think about film and design. There's film as a research tool. There's film as a communication tool. There's film as the possibility of a prototyping tool using the special effects capabilities we have now to really kind of prototype out what certain environments would look and feel like. So I'm really kind of interested to see where else we can take this. How else can we look at film? What kinds of tools can we gather from it? What are your ideas? So I hope some of you will actually talk to me after this. And you know, I just want to thank you a lot for bearing with me and listening. Please feel free to get in touch and leave me some feedback.